Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How you diddling, Ken?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for asking, Rory. Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 268. Wow, those numbers are sure clocking up, Rory. A lot of episodes, a lot of topics covered. And we've got 3 topics we're going to be looking at today, starting off with theory and practice, where we take a bit of theory, we look at how does that show itself in the day-to-day practice of being a therapist. And we're speaking today about postmodern counselling theories. Interesting topic. Enjoyed reading up on that, Rory. We then go into practice today, where we look at something that is contemporary, something of the now, and we're looking at recovered memory therapy today. Before we go into Practice Matters, the CPD section, where we invite special guests. And today we're going to be hearing from Mandy Gosling, who's going to be speaking about the ABC grief model. You reached out, Rory. You held an interview. Lots of interesting information in that. So stick around for it. But kicking us off, counselling theory in practice, Rory. And we're speaking about postmodern counselling theories.
Yes, and I think it would be a good point to start to explain what postmodern means. So we had the Enlightenment where, in the 18th, 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, where people were becoming more enlightened, listening less to the church maybe, and putting more faith in science and philosophy. And if you think of our counselling theories, they're all rooted in philosophy. Person-centered therapy is rooted in phenomenology, which is a kind of late 19th century philosophy. CBT, it comes from Stoic philosophy, which of course was the Greeks, and even psychoanalytical philosophy finds part of Freud's ideas coming from Greek plays, Oedipus and Electra. So they're all basically all the kind of theories that we know are modernist. In other words, the theories of personality are generated from philosophy. Postmodernism kind of rejects that and thinks more in terms of individuals' own life experience. So that's where you get postmodernism from. It rejects modernity. It rejects the kind of historic thinking and effectively starts again. And there's really 2 postmodern therapies, solution-focused and narrative. And I guess both of them, solution-focused speaks for itself. It's to help clients find solutions. And that was developed by Insoo Kim Berg and Steve D. Shazer. And narrative therapy, Michael White and David Epstein, which narrative therapy encourages people to develop their own stories and to reconstruct themselves. And it's quite interesting. It's a departure from the more traditional ideas. And I think the key thing here is there's no real sense of personality theory in postmodern theory, whereas personality theory was generated by philosophy in the more modernity therapy, such as person-centered phenomenology. It would be a really good example of using a philosophy to generate a theory of personality, and Rogers did that in the 19 propositions. Of course, he used that as a base, phenomenology as a base to develop the 19 propositions. So therapy is of our time, Ken.
This is so interesting for me. It's an interesting topic. So let me see if I understand this. So when you're saying postmodernism, it's a way of thinking that kind of rejects that is written, that is taken as I guess the theories of the day, and brings new thinking to that. And I like it. And I recognize it, and I see where its place is. But what I also recognize is how often do we have a chat, Rory, about a certain theory from any of the schools, and we recognize how it kind of interlinks and almost backs up and says almost the same kind of thing as another theorist may have seen. So we're seeing so much of that happening. Are we saying that in postmodernism we're ignoring all of that?
Well, I think postmodernists would use the term deconstructing. And please, no letters in the postbag from postmodernist scholars. Deconstructing, in other words, what deconstruction is in postmodernism is to look at how we believe ourselves to be and look at how we got there. And to answer your question directly, in those questions we ask ourselves, we may very well reference theories of therapies that we've known about sometimes most of our lives. I mean, most people have come to Freud quite early on in their lives, 15 or 16. They may have heard it in history classes and things. So it's a case of deconstructing it. Is what we're told true? And if not, then what else is there? And we create effectively our own truths. Does that answer your question, Ken?
It does. And I guess I'm enjoying this topic because this postmodernism and postmodern counselling theories is not an area I know. It's not an area I study. So I've got all the questions, and hopefully you as listeners have questions on this as well. And I do welcome any postmodern therapists out there. Write that letter, write that email, because I think this would make a great interview, a peek into practice of what it's like to work as a postmodern therapist. And I think I would have a barrage of questions. So kind of trying to understand this further. So are we saying, I guess in a way I get what you were saying about that deconstruction, and I think we always have to be saying, is this the right way? And research, I guess, is part of us disproving biases that are held. And I do recognize that the theories are called theories because they are just that. They're not facts, they're theories. So if we look at psychodynamic, we have Sigmund Freud. He believed our psyche was divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the theory was that subconsciously we were processing things that would bring us discomfort, behaviorism, that our emotional suffering is caused by our faulty beliefs, and of course, person-centered, believing that the client leads the way. You don't need an expert there. Very different flavors that we're talking about there. And I guess as a person-centered therapist in my training, I have changed the way that I work, but I guess that's not going into postmodernism. That's just bringing parts of CPD and other ideas into my theory or into my practice. Or is that part of postmodernism?
Well, I think that's quite. I think that I'm not a postmodernist myself. I have to say, I'm not been trained in postmodern therapy, but I think that's the kind of conversation a postmodernist would have, in that you're deconstructing what you believe to be true and asking fundamental questions. Actually, is what I believe true, or is it what I've always been told? And if that's the case, is there another way that we can help people without making reference to the past? And I mean, therapies develop. I mean, person-centered therapy arguably is developed. However, it still finds its roots in phenomenology, the philosophical basis, the personality basis. Postmodernism would reject that. Postmodernism would say you need to deconstruct that. I think the best example I can give you of postmodern thinking, a friend of mine, Julie, did a sociology degree, and she was asked to write a paper on what is postmodernism. Yeah. Straight question. Describe postmodernism. And the person who got it first wrote on a piece of paper, "This is a postmodernist essay." Nothing else, no references, nothing. You got it first. Because the argument, I know it's brilliant, isn't it? The argument would be that he was being a postmodernist. He wasn't making references to what we believe was true in the past.
Wow.
Postmodernism.
Yeah, I guess there's merit in that, and I get the merit. I'm torn here, Rory, and I haven't been convinced. Not that you're presenting an argument that I should embrace postmodernism, but I do see that we do have to question. We have to continuously question. So I guess another question might be, so if we're looking back in the history and the development of the different theories, and we have Sigmund Freud, and we've got Albert Ellis with behaviorism, and then along comes Carl Rogers, who suggests, no, you don't need an expert in the chair. This is now, the client knows the way. Was that not a drop of postmodernism of its time? Or am I misunderstanding this?
Well, I mean, you could argue that. I think that would be a valid argument. If you're writing a paper, I think you could write that, and there'd be some merit in it. Not that I'm marking your papers anymore. However, I guess that if you were to submit a paper like that, I may very well say, aha. But the bulk of your thinking in person-centered therapy still relies on modernist ideas, such as phenomenology, such as the construction of personality, as seen within that philosophical concept, which is a modernist idea. So although you can develop your ideas, I would say it still falls within modernism. In other words, it still makes reference to the original idea and the original theories that underpin it.
It's an interesting topic, albeit for me personally a little difficult to wrap my head fully around it. You know, I'm looking at a handout, and there is a handout for this. So if you need some guidance on this, go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. Great place to hang out. So many free resources there. But to get this resource we're looking at today, this is the Postmodern Therapy Primer, as Rory has called it. Kind of gives you the idea, gives you a bit of the history, speaks about the Enlightenment, modernism, looks at some of the theories that are established, and then kind of looks at how we look at that from a postmodernism point of view. To get that handout, what do? You go to counsellingtutor.com, you click on the podcast tab, you'll find all of our past podcasts there. Make your way to episode 268, today's episode, and right there on that page you can download it. And what I'm looking at here, Rory, is, and I'm looking at these examples of postmodern therapy, and there's three examples that I see that you have on the handout that you have prepared. One being narrative therapy, developed in the 70s and the 80s, and I see that the idea is that it separates the person from the problem and encourages people to rely on their own skills and experience to overcome the problems that exist in their lives. So are we not saying that the client there is the expert, doesn't it? And here he is. This is in my ignorance arguing, isn't that in itself a theory? Doesn't a postmodern idea eventually become a theory that makes it no longer postmodern? Or am I arguing semantics here? Or am I going too deep?
I think there's a first in your paper right away, Ken. So I think that certainly with narrative therapy, the client and the therapist co-construct alternative stories to people's lives. So I guess that with modern therapy, or the therapies we know, there's a tendency to talk about what we believe is our life, and for the therapist and the client to unpick that and find the meaning in it. Narrative therapy co-constructs alternative stories, so to develop a different view of their life through, I guess, self-storytelling.
Yeah.
And if there is a narrative therapist around who wants to be interviewed,
please,
please pop me an email. I'd love to interview someone. But it does seem to move away from, I guess, a fixed idea of personality. I think that's probably one of the things that would kind of separate postmodern theories from modernity. There isn't a set idea of how people got to where they are.
Yeah.
That is co-constructed within the relationship of the therapist and the client in postmodern therapy.
I'm liking it more and more as you're explaining more of it. Where do I sign up, Rory? Where can I start studying? You've sold it to me. Yeah, no, I think it's a lovely topic. I think it's a lovely idea. It's kind of tempting me to look a little deeper. Solution-focused therapy, I know from my work in days past, I worked in recovery services, and solution-focused therapy was often used, where it wasn't a matter of looking back at the reason why, but more what can you put in place to find a solution now, in your life now, with who you are, with what surrounds you now. Right. And it was very, very effective
Great example there, Ken. That's exactly a postmodern idea.
Yeah.
It's about constructing a reality between you and your client to see how they can move forward, as opposed to being rooted in thinking. I don't suppose it's as much in person-centered therapy, but certainly in psychoanalytical therapies, the idea is the presenting past. Yep. The past affects your future. Well, in postmodernism, that probably wouldn't be a thing. And in terms of behavioural therapy, we are taught to think how we think. Again, that wouldn't be so much of a thing in postmodern therapy, because it would be a case of, okay, here you are. What story do you want to tell about yourself?
Yeah. Interesting. Great topic. Thank you for bringing it, Rory. Don't forget to get your handout. Go to Counselling Tutor Podcast tab, episode 268. It's right there, ready for you to download. That has been Theory in Practice. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. And as we move from theory and practice, we go into practice today. We look at something contemporary, something that you are talking about, you, our audience. And today, recovered memory therapy. Something, again, Rory, I don't know too much about, so I'll have lots of questions and very little valuable input.
I think it was a great conversation. So the reason I brought postmodern recovered memory therapy to the podcast was because it was a topic that came up in our Facebook page. And if you don't know our Facebook, or you're not a member of our Facebook page, just type Counselling Tutor into Facebook, and you'll find us. We'll let you in, and you'll be able to see lots of really interesting conversations. And one of the conversations was about recovered memory therapy. Now, I want to be very respectful of this, because there are two distinct sides when it comes to recovered memories. There are those who say that this is, shall we say, not a scientific or provable way of recovering memories, and that there may not be recovered memories. It might be kind of more, people might be influenced by the therapist. And there are those in the survivor community who say that they've absolutely had recovered memories and it's their reality, and we need to be respectful of both sides. But there are some interesting ideas, and I want to start with someone called Jean Piaget. Now, people will know a lot about Jean Piaget. Anybody who's studied child psychology or children's health, and he was a child psychologist. I think he was Swiss, and he studied his own children and made a theory, and that's still taught today. But very few people know he had a clear memory of being kidnapped at the age of 2 and his brave nurse beating off the attacker. And he had a very clear memory of this. And it was it was such a story that his parents gave a present to the nurse as a thank you for stopping what could have been an abduction. Here's the thing. Many years later, the nurse wrote to the family and said, it didn't happen. I made it up. But here's the thing. Piaget still remembered the incident. He'd had a memory implanted into him, and he still believed it. And there was a theorist called Elizabeth Loftus, a controversial person in her own right, who did some memory studies in the 1970s and 1980s. And and in fact, 1995, her key theory, which was called the shopping mall experiment, was in 1995, and she hypothesized you could place memories into people's minds, and you could convince them that something had happened when it hadn't happened, and it was quite an alarming rate that people believed it. So during the 80s, there was a movement in America called recovered memory therapy, and I think it's still around in some parts. And it's a form of hypnotism to get recovered memories back from trauma survivors. And this is where the debate is, because there's a strong scientific body of evidence to say that it's the therapist's influence that brings back the memories. In other words, by the very fact you say, I think you may have been abused and I'm going to do recovered memory, people will then recover memories that actually don't exist. And there's some notable court cases in the UK where that's happened, and it's been proved without a shadow of a doubt that it didn't. The person who was accused wasn't anywhere near this situation at the time. And in the Facebook comments, one of the things where people were very interested, could I help my client with this? And I think my message is, it's a dangerous path to go down.
Yeah. It's very interesting, and I was glad to see it today. And I know that there is a form of therapy called regression therapy, which is the same kind of idea, where you're going back and you're recovering. I'm putting this in inverted commas. You're recovering memories from maybe a childhood, from a place that you don't actively remember, and then for me, it kind of I struggle when it starts going into past life memories, and it's where that barrier kind of sits, and because they tend to the stories of that regression and retrieving memories, they tend to overlap into hypnosis, past lives. Having not studied it, I don't have the knowledge and the academic knowledge to kind of really comment on it from any point of view, but I know that memory is fallible, incredibly so. Yeah. Even top professionals such as military, where a person has been taught how to observe and how to remember the important details, memories can fail, specifically in a stressful situation. And having memories, false memories implanted, as you've said, Rory, has been shown again and again and again and again to be pretty easy to do. In fact, in one of our previous podcasts, when we spoke about false memories, you yourself, Rory, planted a false memory. We'd have to dig out what episode that was and pop a link into the show notes for this.
I'll tell you what, that's the meteorite. My father, my stepfather, told me that there was a meteorite in our local park just down the road. I live still not very far from the park. And he told me a great story, and I think he was just trying to get his child to go for a walk, see the meteorites. He also told me that Boo Boo Bear lived in the park as well. I never saw Boo Boo Bear either. It was interesting. That was easier to dismiss as I got older, the bear.
Yeah.
However, the meteorite story is one that still sticks. And if I go, there is certainly a rock in the park. And every time I go, I look at it and I still think that's a meteorite.
Yeah.
And if I'm not careful, I get into sort of like conspiratorial ideas like, I bet this must cost a fortune. They hiding it in plain sight so nobody steals it. And there was a plaque on it at one point. I think, I bet they've removed the plaque so no one knows it's a meteorite. And eventually I have to catch myself and go, it's a rock, Rory. It's a rock. Your dad was just kind of being kind to you. Was just, he was just trying to get you out for a walk. He told you a story. You don't believe in Boo Boo Bear who lived in the woods. It's not a meteorite, it's a rock. However, there's still a part of me that thinks it's a meteorite. And I think that one of the very interesting outcomes in a research paper that I read before the podcast called Reports of Recovered Memories of Abuse in Therapy. in a large age representative US national sampling by Lawrence Pathis and Mark H. Pendergrast. So it was published. It was published in a as a paper. One of the things I picked up from the abstract was those whose therapists discussed the possibility of repressed abuse were 20 times more likely to recover abuse memories than those therapists who did not. 20 times more likely. If you say to someone, I think you've got repressed memories, they're 20 times more likely. Now, you could argue that maybe that's because there's a permission. You can have it. You can get your memories back. Or it might be that people just get convinced by the therapist. And, there have been quite a few high-profile court cases in America where people, Roseanne Barr, for instance, the famous actor, accused her parents of abuse. And she's now recanted that, I believe, because she had recovered memory therapy.
Yeah. What is interesting as you're going through this and you're speaking about hypnosis as being maybe one of the approaches that is used, one thing I do know about hypnosis is that when under hypnosis in a very relaxed place, you are more susceptible to suggestion by the very means of it being hypnosis. Now, I can see the other side of this as well. So we do know that we can face traumatic incidences in our lives that we can block out. It's a safety mechanism so that we don't revisit it again and again and again. A memory can be locked away from us. And you can have that uneasy feeling that something should be there and go looking and grasping for it. I do know that when looking for those memories, when touching on the emotion or the trauma that may surround them in horrific cases, it can build the wall thicker. It's difficult to get to a memory when you are in a heightened stage, when you are feeling anxious, and your brain is, producing cortisol. I get that maybe in a relaxed, calm, safe environment with somebody that you feel a level of trust with, that you could maybe explore closer to those memories in the right environment with the right guidance. So I can see the benefits there. I guess the question is how is it researched? How would you know? So you spoke about different cases. Difficult to research because we're relying on a memory, we're relying on that being recovered.
Yeah.
There would need to be some form of hard evidence that kind of showed, yes, that is true, to be able to go, okay, yes. And then how many cases would you need? What would your sample size need? I'm not asking you, Rory, because I'm sure you don't know. You haven't done your doctorate, your PhD on this. But these are the kind of questions that come up for me.
Yeah. And you are right. There are some therapists that recover memories. I mean, EMDR is one, eye movement and desensitivity reprogramming. I think the interest, and that uses, I believe, timelines to put things in the timeline. And one of the things I learned on my first aid course, my mental health first aid course that I took, was that sometimes helping people to put what was happening into a timeline is very useful, because sometimes our brains can scramble information under stress. However, you're dealing with what they know, the memories that they have, not memories that are hidden. And I think, and it's the same with trauma-informed CBT, you're dealing with what the memories are. And there has been some research to state that people who have traumatic events usually remember them. They usually remember them in some form or other.
Yes.
They might not know the detail, but they know that they know it in the abstract. I work with lots of survivors of abuse who have been, were in horrific situations, could tell the lead up to it and the lead out of it, but what happened was scrambled.
Yeah.
They were disassociated. But that's a big difference between working with a memory that exists, that's maybe not be clear, maybe scrambled, and actually recovering that's not there. So think of a memory card. Think of a memory card. You could get a picture and you can see what's on the picture, and you may be able to kind of look at it and enhance it in Photoshop. If you get a memory card where there's nothing there, what you're effectively doing is trying to recover the memories, the pictures from it.
Yeah.
And those may or may not be the reality. They could be influenced by the therapist. So I think my message would be is that you go tread lightly with clients who think they've got repressed memories, because, as you say, suggestion is a very powerful thinker.
It is. And those statistics that you mentioned make it a frightening and powerful thing. 20 times more likely. And, you know, just before we kind of back out of this, I was thinking about you saying it's different when you've got kind of the thread of a memory, that you feel something happen and you maybe not 100% clear. And an interesting example of that is working with people with their dreams. You know, a person might say they had some kind of a dream, but they don't remember it. And by asking questions, it's almost like pulling the thread, asking questions about the dream. So all I can remember is there was this guy. Well, can you describe him to me? What was his hair? Short, long? Did he have a beard? Did he have a... And you get to a point sometimes where someone will go, you've broken my dream. That will happen to me. I'll be speaking to someone like, you've broken my dream. It's a recovered memory. It comes back clearly, and it's like you hit that cluster, that brain cluster, and you kind of everything comes together, and you remember it more. So it definitely piques my interest, Rory, but I agree with you. This is not something without the proper training and working with I guess in a very structured way.
And one final thing, certainly from my trauma-informed training, they talked about implicit and explicit memory. So if you ask most children, you know, what's your first memory? Most children will go back to the age of about 4.
Yep.
That's about when I can remember going to school quite clearly, and a few other things before that. Can't remember too much. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that children's brains, and certainly the hippocampus where stores your memories, like your YouTube, if you like, your YouTube of your mind, isn't developed until children get to about the age of 4. And what happens is you get what you call implicit memory, which is snapshots, little snapshots of things that store in children's minds. But the video memories, the explicit memories, become more predominant as a child gets from 4 onwards. It's just the way the brain develops. So it is possible that you can... I've worked with people who've got snapshots of things, but they're snapshots. They're something that's tangible. I seem to remember this.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can talk about it, but again, very careful not to interpret, very careful not to put a meaning to it, ask the client to put a meaning to it. And also, one of the things that sometimes I think practitioners can sometimes, sometimes just misinterpret is you might ask someone when was the first memory you had, and they said I was 9 or 10, and they immediately think, well, that could be trauma. Don't particularly think that immediately. Could possibly be. We know that people with traumatic childhoods tend to have delayed memory. I mean, that's something that happens a lot. But again, don't overinterpret. You know, just go with what the client brings. But I come back to the final point is that most people who've had trauma remember some of it.
There it is. Practice today, recovered memory therapy, the discussion you started. We are no experts. This is Rory and I, 2 peers, having a chat about something that you brought up. We encourage you strongly. Go to Facebook, type in the word Counselling Tutor. Come and join in the conversation. Come and join our group with tens of thousands of other counsellors, students of counselling, tutors, supervisors. Come and jump in and enjoy the conversation there. We now move into Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is the one that you record on your CPD ledger to hand into your supervisor to get signed off, because we bring in the experts speaking about real life practice. Rory, you spoke with Mandy Gosling about the ABC grief model.
I did. As we know, you know, both of us have been practitioners for a number of years. It's amazing how unexamined grief in childhood can roll through the arc of someone's life. And Mandy Gosling joined me to talk about the ABC grief model, specifically about unresolved childhood grief in adults. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
Grief is an ever-presenting issue in the therapy room, but sometimes what's missed is adults who are grieving still for loss they had as children. it's my great pleasure to interview today Mandy Gosling, a psychotherapist whose expertise and area of interest is adults bereaved at children. So, Mandy Gosling, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rory. It's a real pleasure to be here and to meet you.
Yes, and well, thank you very much. And I guess my first question is this more than we think it is? In other words, do we see more clients bereaved in childhood who present with issues than perhaps we know? Is this something that's hidden? I guess is the question that I'm asking.
Well, Rory, I believe it is. It's been an area of work of mine over the last 13 years. I'm a bereaved child myself. It's 50 years since my mother died, and I became a psychotherapist, and I did a master's research into the topic, and then took to specialize in it. And I think what I've discovered in that time is that it is a hidden grief. And there are 2 to 3 generations of lost mourners who did not have their grief perhaps addressed as we would have hoped, whether that be from a family or a societal aspect, and are still carrying unresolved childhood grief and the complexities that go alongside that.
Yes, and I think sometimes it's worth just reflecting that we live in more enlightened times nowadays in terms of how we, certainly if children are grieving, hopefully there's a lot more support than there was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. I know from bereavements that I had when I was a younger man. I'm 65 now at the time of recording, and I lost my father when I was 18. And it was just a case of, well, you're a man now, get on with it. And that goes through the arc of one's life, really. It's not been addressed. So I guess, do we see clients presenting with issues that on the face of it are not grief, but once you're listening to them and they're in the therapy room, you realise that actually the root cause of their issue is grief? Is that something that happens?
It's something that I see. It's kind of an interesting one. Some people come and see me because they want to explore their unresolved childhood grief. And, other people will arrive because they are presenting with other aspects. So relationship difficulties, health anxiety, depression, burnout. Those are some of the things that you might see. And in an assessment, you would then quickly find out, when you're doing family of origin, inquiries, that they potentially had been bereaved. And that's when I'm looking at sort of drawing upon the knowledge that I've gathered over the years of, say, the root cause. But it's really interesting, Rory, even the people that have unresolved childhood grief don't even realize that is their own cause of distress, because, as you say, 20, 30, 40 years. And that's about a common time of which I see people. By that time, they're thinking, as a society, we're in, it's like we should be over it by now. But of course, there is everything that makes our own sense of self. And then, the compounding aspect of that, isolation or family difficulties or relationship difficulties, or education, is a big one for bereaved children. And so all of that has a knock-on effect. And it's not until things start falling by the wayside and difficult that people come to therapy and you begin to see how grief still manifests, but not necessarily as grief.
Yes, and I think what I'm picking up here is that unresolved childhood grief can permeate into many areas of somebody's life. So I'm guessing that it could be things like relationships, work, their careers, how they view themselves. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yeah, no, that would be a very, very accurate summary. Is the self-esteem is compromised, and then everything that leads on from that. And then you get to the kind of core aspects. So the way I work, generally people will come in, say, with maybe trauma responses, a sort of a heightened state that, they're just not functioning well. And then they've got kind of missing pieces and, their developmental process has been compromised. And then we can kind of get to the grief part and kind of lace that in, to the work. So it's quite slow work and it's gentle work, because obviously if you go to grief first, then that could re-traumatize the client. So it's a very paced and gentle way of working with somebody, because at the core of it is this unresolved grief.
Yes. And I heard you say that part of your work is to do some form of assessment. Is this the assessment that you've developed, or do you use standard tools like CORE, or how does that work?
No, it's assessment from my training centre, where I would look at, what they're coming with, then their family of origin, and what they want to get out of therapy. So I would kind of do that in the beginning of the session. I think one of the interesting aspects also that I see that other therapists have spoken to me about too is what I call second generation. So sometimes because we're now dealing with sort of 2 to 3 generations of people with unresolved childhood grief, we've now got the children of those people who have been also impacted by that. So there may be what I would kind of sort of the polarities of overparenting or underparenting that have been then, played in sort of transgenerational material. So you start to see how it drips through the whole, family system.
Yes, indeed, because of course, someone who's bereaved as a child may go on to be a parent, and then after that might affect their parenting style, how they. You've talked about people who may be over protective of the children, and maybe these are my words, maybe intrusive, or parents who may withdraw from the children, and then that gets carried in to into the next generation, and along it goes. And
these would be very normal responses to somebody who's been bereaved as a child, and so that's kind of the core part of my work, is to highlight how unresolved childhood grief manifests in adults of today, and for people as individuals to be able to understand why sometimes they do the things they do, which would be normal responses, but also as therapists about holding that in the therapy room too, that I wonder if this is grief as well, because that then would be a missing piece as therapists, to actually consider that. And it's a question I would always encourage therapists to ask. Have you been bereaved as a child, or have your parents been bereaved as a child? It's a very simple question to ask at the beginning of therapy. And so that we understand maybe some of what might be happening at a deeper level.
Yes. And I was just thinking as you spoke about that, it does remind me a little bit of constellation work, where you're working with family development and family groups through the generations, through the arc of a development of a family. My other question is this short-term work? Can it be short-term work, or is it by its very nature a longer-term engagement in therapy? And I can see you laughing there as I asked that question.
In all honesty, Rory, I've never found it to be short-term work. I guess it's kind of interesting. I think for some people who just different types of people come, maybe it could be, but generally when you're dealing with things like trauma or child development, disruptions, that's not really short-term work, and it has to be gentle. I mean, you're working with children in adults' bodies quite often. And of course, when therapists work with children, it's a very gentle, it's very long and slow work, because you've got to really manage the responses and be very attuned to the client in the responses that you're picking up in how they are and what's too much and what's not enough, because it's they can be easily triggered.
Yes, I think that's an interesting response, because a lot of people who listen to the podcast might be engaged in short-term therapy, and I've never thought that trauma work or bereavement work was a short-term engagement. It takes time to gently unpick the threads of someone's history.
Yeah.
And I heard you say that you may actually be talking to the child in the room. You may have an adult client, but you may be speaking with the child configuration. In other words, the emotional age that the client presents. And I think that's interesting. And is that something you listen out for, that maybe change in tone where a client's emotional age is presented differently to their chronological age?
Yes, it is, because in my experience, what I notice, because the developmental process has been ruptured in some way, the child ego state has kind of been suspended in time. And of course, that child is present in the room and, trying to get the adult state and the child, speaking to each other. I think inner child work is really beautiful for this way of working, and, to be able to see their grief, to be able to see why, something is not perhaps working in their life as an adult, is because this child, is suspended in time, and we have to go back and pick the child up, bring them forward and understand what that child experienced. Because if the grief is not integrated at the time, or the trauma is not integrated at the time, it will kind of have a hold on the adult in the today's world.
Yes. So what you're really talking about is in the TA canon, if you like, is reintegration. The idea of reintegrating the person. Would that be right?
Yes, it would be. But also then we've got the grief aspect too, which makes it then an added complication, because then, we have a parent who's died, and that grief will be, a forever felt experience. It's just that it's felt hopefully more in an adult sense, although the child is always still present because the grief was experienced as a child. So that's where, it can be kind of tricky to navigate.
Yes. As you say, painstaking, long-term patient work on behalf of the therapist, being really attentive and being very thoughtful, not to rush in too quickly.
Yes, I think I've learned along the way, when I've worked with people myself, where and no case is exactly the same, because for some people they're much more in a heightened state than, say, somebody else, and it's really attuning to the client and kind of stretching, but not overstretching, the ability to be able to tolerate what the dynamic between the client and therapist, is.
Well, I think on those final words, Mandy Gosling, thank you so much for joining us. And if you are interested in Mandy Gosling's work, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to episode 268, where we host our podcasts. You'll see some links to Mandy's website where you can go and explore more and find out about this fascinating and really important world of adults who've been bereaved as children. So, Mandy Gosling, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Mandy Gosling. Big thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding those interesting discussions, bringing us the continuing professional development that we need, that peek into someone else's practice and what they do. This has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 268.
Yes, we start with theory in practice with postmodern counselling theories, rather. A bit of an exploration about new ideas, postmodern ideas in counselling and psychotherapy. In practice today, we talked about recovered memory therapy and the wide range of opinions and theories that go along with that. And then finally, an interview with Mandy Gosling on ABC grief model, unresolved grief in adults. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.